This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Adviser Show. Your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hello and welcome to the final SMSF Adviser Show for 2023. I'm your host, Keith Ford, joined as always by my co-host, Aaron Dunn from Smarter SMSF. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Thank you, Keith. Great to be here for one final time in 2023. Hard to think that I think it's 31 episodes this year, if I wasn't mistaken.
I believe so. We hit 31 episodes of the SMSF Adviser Show in the year 2023. Not all of those was I involved in. You, of course, Aaron, involved in everything. But I came on a little way through the year, as I'm sure some of the listeners are aware. But we've had a good run, 18 together, I believe this will be as co-hosts. So yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, and as we share some of the stats, I think you're going to take lots of the credit when we look at some of the top podcasts for the year, because they all include, or a lot of them include the back half of the year where you're a part of them.
That's right. We've got a few in there. So, I mean, I guess that means that download numbers are trending up and we've got a few more listeners, which is always good. Perhaps we just got lucky with what the topics we were talking about were. Everyone coming in to hear your thoughts on Div 296. That's what everyone wants.
Well, probably, but I think it's more likely that you'll be able to take the credit, given that, like I said, most of them involve you as the co-host. But let's bring this back into some sort of order. And as we said, this session provides us with an opportunity to just do a bit of a wrap up for the year.
That's right.
Not only from a technical context, but I think our audience would be quite interested in finding out a little bit about, the top stories for the year, some of the strategies, and of course, some of the top episodes from our SMSF Adviser Show. So maybe, Keith, we can kick things off.
Absolutely. So the first topic that we're going to touch on in our SMSF Adviser Wrapped, stealing some of Spotify's thunder there. They better not block us from the platform for that. I haven't seen anyone tag SMSF Adviser Show in the top podcasts on their Spotify Wrap, but you never know. I'm sure there's a couple. But no, the first one, it's something that got a lot of run this year. It's the Div 296 tax measures, the $3 million super tax as it's otherwise known. A lot of stuff happening with it this year. Not much of it what our audience would call positive, I guess. A lot of upset feelings, a lot of people not very happy with the government and not just bringing it in, but the way that they bring it in, the specific details and how they're going about figuring it all out. So what did we learn about Div 296 this year, Aaron?
Well, it was the gift that kept on giving. And I think this Labor government feels a bit like Santa at the moment, just sort of handing out legislation at the moment, sort of as they get towards the end of the year. And the Division 296 measures, as we now know them, were announced in February, yet only last week did we see them get introduced into Parliament. So that's the breadth of what we've had throughout the year, which is probably why you thought I sounded like a broken record talking on this topic. But that was the reality of how things transpired. And whilst there was a lot of lobbying and even consultation, the end result is and has been ultimately that it's kind of fallen on deaf ears at this point in time. So we will naturally in the new year talk about what might occur as we move into 2024. But I think you rightly stated there that the outcomes weren't necessarily positive in the context of its impact on SMSFs, and the large majority of those will be impacted by this measure, will be SMSF members. And yeah, I think it's just the frustration of where things are at, but it was talked about ad nauseum all throughout the year.
Absolutely. And I think you did touch on a big reason for that, particularly among our audience, is that it does disproportionately affect SMSF members versus the rest of the broader Australian public. There is, of course, there's people that are beyond the $3 million cap in the APRA sector. It's not exclusive to the SMSF funds, but a far larger proportion of SMSFs fall into this category than those APRA funds, which I guess is in part, you're going to expect it. if you're taking on an SMSF and the effort and everything that's involved in that, you are likely to have a higher balance. So it does make sense, but it also brings in a lot of those concerns around, is it the family farm that's held within the SMSF, and how does that work with the liquidity rules and taxing of unrealized gains and all sorts of things along those lines. So it's unsurprising that the SMSF audience had their finger on the pulse of this story.
Yeah. And I think, again, there wasn't necessarily pushback in the context of proposing an additional tax based upon high balances, but it's the calculation and the lack of indexation that have ultimately been the major concerns and have remained the major concerns. And therefore, that's really where a lot of the frustration has landed and will stay as we move into 2024 as well, as this bill moves into both houses with the Labor government's view to try to get this resolved and locked away into the new year.
Yeah, definitely not expecting to see huge differences at any point, really, which has been the story, as you mentioned, the whole way through.
Yep.
Yeah, fun times for everyone involved. Another piece, some of the other measures that were happening this year are NALE, NALE. It's looking good at the moment in terms of getting a resolution, but perhaps not what everyone necessarily wanted or what was intended. Where are we at now, and where did we come from with the NALE, NALE measures?
Well, if we think the Division 296 measures have dragged out, these ones go back to 2018 and potentially before. So
Div 296 is practically Speedy Gonzalez at this point. Yeah,
correct. And I think there are plenty of other measures that would fall into that trap that make the government's push on this quite quick. But the NALE measures have gone through a Senate inquiry recently, and that Senate report has come back, in essence, stating that the government should proceed with the measures as had been drafted and no real change to the SMSF measures that have been added into Section 295/550. So whilst the arguments that were put forward by the accounting bodies and the SMSF Association were to argue that this problem doesn't really exist anymore, and potentially we look at an integrity measure that sits within the SIS Act. Again, Treasury has countered that argument. We've seen similarly some other submissions before that Senate inquiry state similarly. So ASFA was in that boat. So I think the reality is we're now likely to see the government move forward in its current form, where we have a 2 times multiple applied to that non-arm's length expenditure that has been incurred or hasn't been incurred, in essence, and that will apply from, in essence, the 1st of July 2023 in respect to the general expenses inside a self-managed fund. So it's not the outcome that was intended, but it could have been a lot worse. It was mooted at one stage to be 5 times, and it's clearly a lot better than the current law, which would have tainted all of the fund's income as well. So yeah, another example of consultation, really working both sides of Parliament fairly hard, I guess, upper house also, or the lower house, and then the Senate and crossbenchers and so forth. But the reality is we're back to where we were from when it was introduced into Parliament initially.
Well, I mean, sometimes the gears of government move slowly, but eventually you do get an outcome.
Correct. And it's the outcome that, funnily enough, will typically work through what gets negotiated.
Look, I mean, I guess if no one's really happy and no one got what they wanted, that's the hallmark of a good negotiation, right? Where both sides are upset?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the saying. So yes, mission accomplished, I think they might say.
Mission accomplished, that's it. And another piece of fairly important, very high-minded, I guess, or broad spectrum ideas that we're looking at, and that has been a big part of the conversation this year, is the objective of super. So it's something that's important. The super system within Australia is huge, for one, and also very important to a lot of people's retirement and the way that they can live with a bit of dignity in their old age and have access to funds once their working life has stopped. And it's no longer just a pension system. We've got the compulsory super, so that everyone's got access to some funds from their working lives. So in many people's views, there is an objective of super, and why do we need to worry about having it legislated? But the government at the moment, they're looking to prevent probably any tinkering that's going to impact preservation, I think, is the main driving force from them.
I'd also argue Division 296, which appeared to also, these two, in my view, will be forever linked together.
This has definitely been something that you've been on from the beginning. And I think it's a really good observation that it's pretty much tracked. It's been in lockstep, objective of super, Div 296, objective of super, Div 296. And the way they're kind of moving through it, they're getting this first part done, then they move to this first part, then the second.
As the justification.
It's very interesting. Yeah. So it's certainly been something that's been quite talked about, and a lot of people have different feelings, but I think the idea of trying to maintain preservation of those funds, because it can have such an effect down the line. I don't think anyone in our audience is going to disagree with that kind of idea that, if you take money out of super early, what it costs you is way more than just the funds that have come out. So, from that perspective, they're definitely trying to maintain preservation, but all of the other language, I guess, within the legislation they've put forward has been a bit interesting. And how do you define these specific terms, and what do they mean when it's in legislation, I guess, has been interesting.
Yeah, and this was part of the challenge originally when this objective was stated back in 2013, and there was a bill in 2016, and ultimately that all lapsed because there were issues with terminology and some of it becomes very subjective. So I think the principle is right, because we certainly want to be taking a view that superannuation is there for the good and the good of retirement, and making sure that there is a level of compulsion of savings, because we know the long-term benefits of compound interest, in essence, which is what it is. And therefore stating a purpose that is above and beyond things like the sole purpose when legislation and stuff is framed does make sense. But, it's the whole premise of not everyone's necessarily going to agree, but I think you want to be able to make steps in its progress and then be able to continue to see it evolve as circumstances change, like we're seeing the government of the day look at now, recognizing that retirement is becoming a much bigger focus than simply just looking at, accumulated benefits as we traditionally have since, SG was introduced back in, sort of 92, 93. So these sort of things need to move with the times. Now, I'm not saying they move every year, but, those periods of which we need to make sure that the government looks at these issues and addresses them, and then where relevant, allowed to move forward, because it is there designed to test and measure policy decisions. And that's really the challenge of it. Just like you do with any bill, goes through assessments against human rights and this sort of thing. Any superannuation policy should ultimately be tested against that. And that's what the government is trying to do here. Like you said before, maybe some of it is to just limit any of the activity that we saw the coalition government do during the pandemic period as well.
Yeah, of course. That's certainly something that they're looking at, is that preservation, people dipping into it. There has to be a pretty compelling reason, obviously if there's some kind of life-threatening issue that comes up and you need to access it for that. I mean, it makes sense to be able to do so, because what good's retirement savings if you're not around in retirement? So
yes, correct.
There's a couple of areas where, okay, yeah, this might make sense. But yeah, no, that idea of getting it in there is, I suppose there's good and bad with everything. It always comes down to the detail, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that is the reality in a lot of these things, is we go through long periods of negotiation to try and get outcomes. But sometimes until you get the actual detail, so you're getting the regulations to match the legislation, you then potentially find some of the challenges at that point in time. But conceptually, it's the right way to go. Again, you're not going to make everyone happy, which is really where the government thinks is probably the right spot for it to land.
That's it. Look, I mean, if a government could make everyone happy, they'd never be voted out, would they? So,
No,
and if we know anything, it's that governments always eventually get voted out. So moving on from the objective of super, something that has been, persistent for the entire year, dating a few months back into 2022, is inflation, which has obviously caused a lot of cost of living pressures. It has skyrocketed the prices of things. There's many different reasons for that, all sorts of geopolitical reasons that we really don't need to be getting into on a podcast about SMSFs. But one thing that it did also do is push the general cap. It increased that quite a bit from, I believe, 1.7 million to 1.9 million, Aaron.
Yeah, that is correct. So inflation, I think, and interest rates generally as well, I guess, which we'll talk to shortly. But these sort of inflationary pressures that we've seen in the marketplace did have a pretty profound shift in the strategies, because we did see the general transfer balance cap, as you said, go from 1.7 million to $1.9 million. And I know some of the articles that we saw during the year did talk about, the fact that you've got this opportunity now to, in essence, get more retirement money into the pension phase, or more money into the retirement phase, I should say. It opened up opportunities for people to be able to make more contributions, because their ability to make a non-concessional was changing from 1.7 million to 1.9 million, and you had phase-ins in respect to whether that bring forward period could be 3 years, 2 years, or 1 year. So I think that certainly had a fairly substantial impact on a lot of the strategies that we saw. And we did see some people simply wait until the 1st of July with some of the pension strategies, because they were wanting to capitalize on that uplift, that inflationary uplift that was occurring at the start of this financial year.
As you mentioned, inflation was huge in all sorts of different ways. Just a good reminder there about with inflation of exactly why the Div 296 people wanted that indexed, is because between the point that it was proposed and now, the $3 million is not the same $3 million. So, it happens quick. Life comes at you fast.
Yeah. And it's funny because, we end up with things that are linked to CPI, like we saw the transfer balance cap. But we see other pieces of law, like the concessional cap, linked to wages. So whilst we saw adjustments to the transfer balance cap, we actually didn't see any changes to the concessional cap and the non-concessional cap, because the wage growth was nowhere near the extent to which we saw inflation grow in that same period.
For sure. We also saw the end of some COVID relief on minimum pensions.
Yeah. So the 50% reduced minimum pension that we'd had for some period of time obviously ceased. And I guess before we touched on interest rates and the costs of living with those increases, well, pensioners have been a real beneficiary of those changes, because whilst they've been benefactors of the changes to the interest rates, it's then actually helped them in a lot of instances to be able to meet that additional cash flow that they need for their minimum pensions every year. So there's been a lot of stories naturally being spoken about with the pressures of those that have home loans and interest rate costs. And we know SMSFs from an interest rate point of view are paying much higher than even you look at that home loan rates and so forth. But on the flip side, the story is we're seeing more income being generated in self-managed super funds through cash and deposits, which SMSFs do tend to hold more in that than other superannuation funds. And therefore, we're seeing the ability for pension members to be able to take more money out of the fund, in addition to them being forced to take it out of the fund. And then it comes back to our inflation issue, because if they're actually forced to take it all out, are they sticking it under the bed, or are they actually putting it back into the economy and then actually driving inflation further as well? So that's an interesting challenge and discussion in itself about what impact our baby boomers are actually having through this mandating of retirement income coming out into their own hands, given that interest rates are much higher than they have been for some period of time.
That's it. It's shockingly, the economy is all linked.
Yes.
Everything's tied together. And one thing happens, it can have all sorts of unintended and intended consequences. So it is certainly something that that has flow-on effects throughout the rest of the economy and impacts people that have nothing to do with temporary minimum pension relief. They still get impacted. So, it's important stuff. We also saw the T-bar requirements for SMSFs moved from a 2-tiered system to all quarterly reporting. I'm sure we talked about this on the podcast previously while I was the co-host. I remember you talking about this quite well.
Yeah, so we've now seen the implementation of this measure. So the ATO, originally, we had what was as you said, a 2-tier system based upon individuals that had balances under or over $1 million in essence. But as all things, as technology advances in industries, the expectation of the regulator needed to change. And therefore, we now see this mandated requirement of having to report 28 days after the end of the quarter in which the event occurred for all self-managed super funds. So it is a fairly significant shift. Doesn't mean that you have to do quarterly reporting, but it just means that there is a much greater focus on needing to keep information of a self-managed fund up to date and being aware of the events that might impact the member's transfer balance account and get those reported on time. And at some point, I think the ATO will shift from educator to enforcer in this with some potential failure to lodge penalties. We haven't seen that as yet, but as things kind of settle with the introduction of this, I would suspect that we'll see that sort of thing come into play as we move into the new year as well.
Absolutely. And, something that has been a consistent theme throughout the year, the quality of advice review. Mm-hmm. We've had more movement in recent weeks than perhaps the rest of the year. It was quite slow for most of the year. I think you'd agree on that. It was around this time of year last year in 2022 that the report was actually delivered to the government by Michelle Levy. We did not get a response for quite some time. It took quite a few months to get a response from the government. But, when it did, it came in those 3 tranches, the clearing up red tape, super funds, and then the measures that they didn't immediately accept in principle, which, that'll all get worked out. We've seen a bit of movement on it more recently, which is obviously promising. We're kind of going to focus on what happened throughout most of the year. If you want to hear a bit more on recent QAR developments, the IFA podcast is always a good way to go. We should have something up on that pretty soon as well. But Aaron, the general feel to the QAR, what were your thoughts throughout the early part of the year and the slow movement of government once again?
Yeah, well, I guess from an industry point of view, I think it would be fair to say slow, maybe even underwhelming, might fall into that as well at this point in time. And, and even to the extent that they've rolled out some of these, I think at this stage, we even jokingly said, well, phase 1, we've probably got 1A and then we're expecting 1B before the end of the year and so forth. But yeah, I think from an SMSF industry point of view, you could break this down into advisors and then obviously the accountants, because the scope of the accountants was meant to be included in this and they just appear to be washed away entirely as part of this process, which again is a fairly disappointing outcome. From the advisors' point of view, there was obviously a sense of optimism by advisors from the final report that Michelle Levy had put together. Again, seeing the government kind of pick that apart and then position, these elements, start to, question some elements of it. But, if the government can get a few quick wins and goals, then, the benefits of this might be seen. But again, we're going to have to move into 2024 before we really see anything. So the government will argue that, it needed the year to sort of work out what was right and steer the ship in the direction that it wants. The industry would argue, well, that's what the review process was for in the previous year. So I think at this stage, slow is probably the right response, but we just need to wait and see how the government might move forward as we look into 2024.
That's it. And, obviously the way that Michelle Levy delivered it, it was certainly meant to be taken all as a holistic recommendation. It obviously was broken down into individual recommendations, but the way she framed it was certainly around it kind of all being a package and with the idea that it should all be adopted and work in concert with each other. And that's certainly not the way that the government has taken on board, which, I mean, in fairness, is kind of how the government always works with these things.
And I think, and the reality,
take them on.
Yeah, and the reality is, the current government will argue that it was a review that was undertaken under the former government. So, it's always the out. We're happy to take all these things on board, but it was under the remit of the former government. So we're doing the right things for the consumers.
That's it.
And move on. So I think they are, from a technical point of view, some of the top issues that we've seen for the year. I guess, Keith, from SMSF Adviser, obviously many of those form part of the top stories of the year, but were there any other items there that piqued the interest of the readers throughout 2023?
That's it. There were, I mean, obviously, look, rate rise stories always generate a lot of traffic on the site. People want to see what's going on, hear a little bit of the commentary of the people around it. But most of what we've already talked about, they were among the top stories around those. One that did pop up was Melissa Caddick and the class action that was launched against her and all of the different details. There was, the auditors being brought into this, all of the different liquidation of her assets at certain points. So there was a lot going on with that. But that is one of the kind of outlier stories that was not connected to those broader big government moves, which of course have gotten a lot of interest from the industry.
So it's kind of your Netflix binge thing that you wanted to get throughout the year, other than the news stories.
That's it. It's the underbelly, which correct. We did, of course, get an underbelly of this already previously done. I think did that come out in 2022 or?
Yeah, I think it was actually.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. But then, of course, we also had a lot of great strategy pieces on the site. Again, many of them talking about similar topics. A lot of NALE related strategy pieces, but there's also, things looking at more specific issues that SMSF advisors need to be aware of, like, the consequences when the minimum pension amount is not met.
Yeah.
If there's a delayed payment of a death benefit to a spouse, whether that's taxable, all these kind of ideas, which are very interesting. And of course, people love reading on the site.
Yeah. And I think when you look at these strategy ones, they are deliberately designed as being more practical based pieces. So trying to understand the nuances of certain scenarios that become very common in practice. So the payment of death benefits, as you said, to a spouse, the whole member versus death benefit issue has been sort of mulling around for most of the year, understanding the various factors that occur when someone fails a minimum pension. And of course, the tried and true that exists for a long time now is the whole issue of BDBNs and the validity of those and the cases that we see throughout the years. And so, the warning around the advising of BDBNs was obviously another clear winner when we look at the top strategy articles on SMSF Adviser.
Absolutely. And one that I'm not surprised was in the top 5, just, headline alone, do this after June 30 and you could boost your super by $110,000. I mean, how do you not click through on that?
Yeah, correct.
How do you turn it down?
Yeah.
But yeah, so they're kind of the strategy topics that were big throughout the year. I mean, the podcasts as well. We can run through our top 5 podcasts for the year and who we had on in our interview portions. So the top one for the year was The Rise of the Millennial SMSF Trustee, which had Greg Hansen from Hub24 and Joe Hurley from Class, which, it is something that's quite interesting, this idea that there are people joining SMSFs quite a bit younger, but also the idea that millennials are not as young as you think anymore.
That is very true. But we did see, I think we only spoke about it in our last episode, was the recent ATO statistics, and the fund establishments are obviously jumped up to highs that we haven't seen for some time. And a lot of that sits squarely in this area of millennials, and where we're seeing really strong uptake in that 35 to 45 age bracket as an example. So that doesn't surprise me that people are starting to try and understand a bit more where entrants are coming into the SMSF industry and what those behaviours actually look like with individuals that are attracted to taking, greater choice and control with their retirement savings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another highly downloaded episode was what SMSFs need to know about crypto compliance, which had a couple of people from Crypto Tax Calculator. We had their CEO, Shane Brunette, and the tax counsel, Harrison Dell, who's also director of Cadena Legal. Crypto is obviously something that many would not be aware of what they can and can't do within that space and with an SMSF. So it's important to, get some information on that side. So it's, I can see why a lot of people kind of jumped in and had a listen to that one.
Yeah. And again, I think it's an area that people are still trying to understand. I think it's been fairly newsworthy throughout the year with some of the things that have gone on in that crypto space. But when it comes to trying to understand what it looks like in the context of SMSF, certainly understanding the accounting and the tax issues and stuff has been highlighted here that, there's clearly an appetite for people wanting to understand more, and the fact that those inquiries are coming through probably from those millennials we were talking about, if they might want to invest in crypto.
That's a good point.
As well. Yeah.
What's next for the $3 million threshold? That unsurprisingly got a lot of listens. That particular episode had Tracy Scotchbrook, who's the head of policy and advocacy for the SMSF Association. And it also had Tony Negline, who's the superannuation and financial services leader at Chartered Accountants. So, I mean, we can probably mostly skip talking about this episode just because we have hammered this $3 million threshold so much throughout the entire year, but also on this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reality here was that we were quite fortunate because, throughout the year as things were progressing and there were consultations and so forth, we were able to sort of tap into experts from within the relevant member bodies that were making submissions and discussions with Treasury and the like. And this was one example throughout the year as things unfolded. The audience was able to get some insights into the way that the industry were trying to have discussions with Treasury around the approach to the Division 296 tax.
Absolutely. How to handle longevity risk for retirees was another episode that got a bit of run. That included Simon Abood from Allianz Retire Plus. And we also had why private credit should be part of your SMSF portfolio, which was a fairly recent episode, including Andrew McVeigh from Romara. Some interesting information in there. I mean, look, I'm sure as with all of these, big part of why people were tuning in was to hear your thoughts on the news of the previous week or the previous fortnight, depending on what our release schedule was at the time. But there was definitely interesting stuff in both of those interviews as well. Yeah,
without question. And I think, as we said at the very beginning, we had 31 episodes for this year. And I guess from my point of view, it's been a lot of fun.
Good to hear.
Sitting down and going through and doing these interviews with a range of people. So whether it's, we go through periods where we have different organizations that come in and talk to specific issues and products that are readily available in the marketplace, through to people like the SMSF Association, Chartered Accountants, FAAA, and those within sort of private enterprise within the industry. It's been fantastic. And I guess from both of us, a special thank you to everyone that's been a part of our SMSF Adviser shows for the entire year. It can be challenging sometimes to come up with content on an ongoing basis, but I think it's fair to say we rarely have times where we're chasing to get content.
I think that's fair. Yeah. There's usually, it feels like particularly this year, but it's probably not unique to this year, but there has been a lot of those big stories where there's been a lot of stuff happening on an ongoing basis. And so we've been able to kind of touch back in on these stories throughout the year and kind of get the information out and get your perspective on what the latest happenings are in these spaces.
Yep, absolutely. So if I said to you, is there one thing, given that you've been new to the SMSF Adviser Show this year and you're about 18 episodes or so in, what's the one thing that's sort of stood out for you as you've sort of dipped your toe into the SMSF space here?
Look, it's definitely been interesting. I've been learning a lot about the industry over these last, 6 or so months. I can't even remember when we started, But about 6 months or so, it's been great to talk to a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives on the industry and coming from a lot of different angles and talking about different parts of it. So, whether it's things like we've seen in here about like crypto or longevity risk and things like that, and how to work private credit into things, that's all been really interesting, hearing how it works specifically within an SMSF. But also, getting your expertise on some of these issues and hearing your take on what's been going on has certainly helped to broaden things out. Having to remember that the $3 million super tax is called Division 296. That also took me a little bit of time, and just, getting a bit of a deeper understanding of all of those different little nuances that are very specific to the SMSF space.
Absolutely. Yeah. The different acronyms that we use.
Of course.
But I think from my point of view, it demonstrates two things. I guess the community that exists with the diversity in that community of the SMSF industry. So as you rightly said, we've had discussions around technical issues, but we've looked at things like longevity risk. We're talking about the scope and the way in which advice might look under the QAR. We're looking at case law. We might look at technology. These are all facets that come together in an industry. And as I said before, we don't really need to go out too far to be able to get a hook on the line to grab someone in that's prepared to talk and share openly about, what role they're playing or how they're going about something, or something that our audience should be looking out for when it comes to their SMSF clients. And having been involved in this since the very beginning, that's the one thing to me that stands out is the openness and ability of people that want to share and help the industry move along and become bigger and better and stronger each and every year.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that wraps us up for 2023.
We are done for the year.
Yes. Well, to everyone that listens, a big thank you, whether you listen to us once or each and every, I can't even say fortnight because there's 31, so it doesn't even add up.
Yeah, we put in a bit of extra work a few times throughout the year.
Yeah, we've overgiven.
That's it.
So, whether it's 1, 2, 31, however many it is, a special thank you. Have a great break over Christmas, and to you, Keith, as well. And we look forward to you joining us as we kick off for 2024.
All right. Thank you, Aaron, as well. Appreciate you bringing me on and having me here as your co-host as well. Been great to have it. And everyone can, if you want to go back and listen to some of the older podcast episodes, many of them will still be relevant. Look, some of the breaking down the news of the week or fortnight might be a little bit out of date, but you can maybe have a listen and see where we were right off base. So.
Yeah. And if you've got, as we always say, if you do have any things you'd like to hear about or speakers you'd like to hear from as we move into 2024, they can get in contact with us. How?
Editor at smsfadvisoronline.com.au.
Excellent. Well, Merry Christmas, everyone, and we'll see you in 2024. Bye for now.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Feeling trapped by rising interest payments? Escape from mortgage prison with expert refinancing assistance from Finny. We have helped hundreds of borrowers break free from higher loan repayments by finding a more suitable loan. Our expert team can quickly assess your situation, and if there's a better lender available, we'll find it fast. Don't delay. Call today. Speak to a Finny mortgage specialist on 02 8866 2444 or visit our website at www.finny.com.au.